Okay.
Well, good evening and welcome to this latest Harif Zoom event. Hope you've all had a good summer, and we're delighted to be starting our autumn program tonight. Harif, for those who don't know us, is the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. And our mission is to raise awareness of the history, culture, and heritage of these Jews. We have a website, www.harif.org. And in order to receive details of our events, you just need to be subscribed and you will receive all the details. Um, we also have a news blog or sister website called Point of No Return, which is updated daily. You can access that by clicking on news on the Harif website. And we send out daily emails with the day's post, just to keep you informed of the news. This session will be recorded and uploaded to our Harif YouTube channel. Just go to our Harif website and click on videos, and you will see the full extent of our recordings. There are perhaps over 150 of them. And hopefully the recording will be up within a day or so, or perhaps even sooner than that. Um, there will be an opportunity to ask our guest speaker questions after his lecture, but please do pop your question or your comment in the chat, which is the button at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Professor John Strawson, and he will be speaking on the topic of the anti-Semitic roots of Arab nationalism. So while European anti-Semitism influenced Arab nationalist politics, it was not its source. And as Arab nationalism took shape, some strands of the movement saw Jewish nationalism as a threat to Arab independence. With the creation of the Arab League in 1945, implacable opposition to Jewish self-determination had become a central political position. So I'm delighted to welcome John Strawson, who is emeritus professor in the law faculty at East London University. And he will examine how anti-Semitism entrenched itself in the very roots of Arab nationalism. And this explains why resolution to conflict in the Middle East is so difficult today. John Strawson has held a visiting position at the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, in the Netherlands, and has been visiting professor at Birzeit University in Palestine and at the International Islamic University of Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur. And his publications include Partitioning Palestine, Legal Fundamentalism in the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, Law After Ground Zero, and Injustice, Memory, and Faith in Human Rights. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Professor Strawson, who will speak for about 45 minutes. So thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Lynn, for that nice introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak to Harif. It's a pleasure. And what I want to do today is just try to have a survey of what might be the anti-Semitic roots of Arab nationalism, by which, of course, I don't mean that all strands of Arab nationalism are anti-Semitic, but merely to look at those strands which are. And I began to think about this extremely seriously just a month after October the 7th, when I was visiting Kibbutz Kfar Aza, which, as you know, had suffered a terrible attack on October the 7th. 61 people had been killed, over 20 people had been taken hostage, and the kibbutz had been very much destroyed. And although I was about perhaps 6 weeks after the events, you could still smell the burning and you could still smell the death. And as I was walking through, particularly the youth part of the kibbutz, which had suffered particularly heavily, I began to think of the connections between anti-Semitism and Hamas, obviously, but I also began to think of the history of anti-Semitism and try to work out, what did this event, October the 7th, represent? Was it a pogrom, which many people thought of it as? And of course, it had many of the features of a pogrom. And those of us, perhaps not in this audience, but certainly from my case, my family come from a lot of it comes from Ukraine, my father and my maternal grandfather. And so I thought of the pogroms, and the last time that my family certainly suffered in them, which was as late as 1919. And I wondered, what was this? Was this Hamas mimicking European anti-Semitism, carrying out something which was so recognizable as a pogrom in the sense of what took place, the torture, the murder, the rapes, the burning, the destruction? Was that something which had been learned from Europe, or did it come from elsewhere? And I have to say, in those discussions after October the 7th, many scholars and commentators were making a great deal of the parallels between Nazism and between what took place, between the pogroms and what took place. And the particular scholar who I think wrote just before then, published a book on Arab anti-Semitism, Matthias Kunzel, the German scholar, says, of course, that the Arab League War of 1948 was an aftershock of the Second World War and was a result of the influence of Nazism on the Arab nationalist movement. And I want to push back against that a little. I'm not saying there wasn't an influence of Nazism, and obviously it had a big influence on the Mufti, al-Husseini, the titular leader of the Palestinian national movement in the 1930s and 40s. But I wanted to really understand why anti-Semitism within Arab nationalism was, from the European side, so easily accommodated. What was it that made the Nazi appeals and the Nazi narratives and ideology appealing within certain sections of the Arab elite and also the Arab nationalist formations? And in doing so, I began to reflect upon the studies which I certainly made about Arab nationalism, but also in the context of the rise of Islamism, of political Islam. And when one was talking about the rise of Arab nationalism, which really dates from the second half of the 19th century, of course, that was also the time of what we often refer to as the Islamic revival. And so I think it's quite important to reflect upon that period. And there are I think, far too many commentators and sometimes scholars who tend to skip over the actual history inside the Middle East and North Africa and the Levant in such a way as to overemphasize the way in which Europe has created the modern Middle East, shaped its politics, and to some extent created the conflicts which exist, which one sees certainly very strongly in Britain in the way in which the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is often talked about as if Britain has some responsibility owing to its role, very, very brief role in the mandate for Palestine from the occupation of Palestine in the First World War to 1948. But I wanted to think more broadly of this. Now, it's absolutely true that, of course, Europe's relationship with the Middle East in the modern sense begins with the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt at the end of the 18th century. And although this was a very brief period, it's certainly true that the Napoleonic expedition, which meant for about 2.5 years Egypt and what we would now call Syria and Palestine, Israel, were occupied by the French. Although they were defeated militarily, they certainly had a big impact upon Egyptian society. And what one saw in the 19th century in the formation of the modern Egyptian state, particularly after the 1830s and the coming to power of Muhammad Ali, in terms of a modernization of Egypt, was, of course, the influence of French as a language and of the French legal system as a cultural import. And it's against that kind of background that we begin to see the rise of how Arab nationalism as a modern movement develops through these two twin conceptions of nationalism and the Islamic revival. And of course, in seeking to understand the history of relationships between Jews and Arabs in the Arab world, it is, of course, with the history of Islam. Now, of course, as we know, Jews were constructed by Islam not as a supernatural conspiratorial force, but as a group of religious adherents who, as a community, seem to have a rebellious relationship with prophecy, both the prophecy in the Jewish period, and of course from the 7th century, the rejection of the Prophet Muhammad. So Jews were not seen so much as they were within Christian anti-Semitism as being evil, having a particular animus, but actually being people in the Arab Islamic world as having an inadequate relationship with God, and had not only rejected the Hebrew prophets, but of course had rejected the Prophet Muhammad. And therefore, as we know, the series of the way in which the Jewish communities within the Arab and Islamic world developed is not necessarily a rosy story, but it's not a story in which Jews are portrayed as intrinsically evil. So what's interesting to notice in the 19th century is the way in which there begins to be a transformation of the understanding of Jews. And it comes from two sources, that there is this influence of Europe, because modern nationalism, as it develops in Europe as a consequence of the period of the European Enlightenment, the conception of the idea of nations, the great revolutions which take place, of course, in Europe and in the United States, which create this conception of a modern nation, which is related to culture, and society. It's very interesting, of course, that modernism, which comes to us from the French Revolution, is, of course, a modernism which excludes Jews as a people, though not Jews as individual citizens. The French Revolutionary slogan was, "For the Jew as a citizen, everything; for the Jew as a people, nothing." In other words, the European Enlightenment is very clear that Jews do not have an independent nationality or ethnicity. They are a religious minority, and they are a curious religious minority in the sense that they don't adapt to being modern. That is precisely, of course, what Marx argues on the Jewish question, that the Jews, and he uses lots of quite anti-Semitic conceptions, stand in the way of modernization. And he says, in order to liberate humanity, we have to liberate humanity from the Jews. And these ideas of nationalism, in which the Jews do not figure as a nation, are very, very strong within Europe, and of course still are very persistent, as a matter of fact, within the way in which the Jewish state is understood within Europe and the United States in many and unfortunately increasing radical circles, particularly we would say on the left or extreme left. Those ideas of the role of Jews as a loyal minority, but not as a nation, become quite rooted within Arab nationalism, and also find a reflection within this Islamic revival. So, for example, if we take Rashid Rida, one of the major participants in the Islamic revival, I think he lived from something like 1865 to 1935, he increasingly saw himself as someone who had to stand up to Jewish nationalism. And he probably is the first person to write a systematic series of articles against Zionism, which actually appear in 1898, after the first Zionist Congress. And the position which he has become increasingly anti-Semitic, that the Jews are a cunning people, they're only good with money, and that's a good thing because that's their only skill. They have no skills, for instance, in the military field, which is particularly ironic today, perhaps. They have no real contribution to science or learning more broadly. That they're just traders. But they're also dangerous, and a Jewish state would be dangerous. And these ideas are not just propagated amongst a small circle, but they're also propagated through a newspaper associated with the Islamic revival, Al-Manar, ironically, the lighthouse. And so the ideas of Rida are quite significant. And in one of the first real texts of Arab nationalism by Naguib Azuri, though written, it has to be said, in French, Al-Manar, of course, Manar was in Arabic. In French, he writes a book about the rise of Arab nationalism within the Turkish and Ottoman Empire, but says at the same time that the big problem for Arab nationalism is that it's in a race with Jewish nationalism, and that what the Arab nationalist movement, which is very early, has to recognize is that there is a universal Jewish peril that if they're not careful, will beat the Arabs in terms of their national aspirations. and create an Arab, a Jewish state, and will supplant the Jews. And his arguments I said, are in French. They undoubtedly represent some of the Enlightenment views, but they're also quite indigenous. And as we can see also from the ideas of Rashid Rida, that this conception is not confined to one person or to one particular movement or strand of the movement. And this is something that we need to bear in mind in thinking of the environment which is being created, in which in the 1930s and 40s, Nazi ideas arrive in the Middle East. But before this, we also have some very important, of course, indigenous developments. We have, of course, the Balfour Declaration of 1917. And very soon after the Balfour Declaration, the British, of course, occupy Jerusalem and begin their three-decade occupation of what becomes the Palestine Mandate and also what becomes Jordan, Transjordan at the time. And that, of course, raises the whole question, because the Balfour Declaration has said that the British government view with favor the creation of a national home for the Jews in Palestine. Of course, national home, it has to be said, is not defined. There's no such thing in international law as a national home. It's unclear what it is. Of course, the British use that very cleverly towards the end of the 1930s to say that actually the national home has been created and they don't need to do anything more, which is why they can then restrict Jewish immigration under the 1939 White Paper. But the Arab reaction, of course, to the arrival to this idea that there could be a national home for the Jews in Palestine is first of all resisted by Syrian nationalists who regard the whole of what is now Palestine and Israel as part of Syria, South Syria. And in the General Congress and the revolt against the mandates, of course, attempt to assert control over the whole of the area of what becomes the British Mandate, and because they fail, but in so doing, of course, they want to stop Jewish immigration. And secondly, of course, we have an associated process together with this Islamic revival of the 19th century, with the creation in Egypt in 1928 of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood is really the first modern Islamist movement, whereas Rashid Rida and some of the others involved in the Islamic revival are clear that Islam has to be against colonialism. There's a big argument as to whether Islam is about modernization or about returning to some notion of traditional idea of Islam. And what the Muslim Brotherhood do is create the political and ideological basis, which of course Hamas is part of the Muslim Brotherhood in the modern period, create the idea that Islam has been a great disaster, that the leadership of the Islamic world are traitors. They've become increasingly secular, Western, retreated from the ideas of Islam, and that what you have to do is not only to get rid of the current leadership, but you have to return to what is said to be an idealized version of the beginnings of the Islamic society during the period of the Prophet Muhammad. This movement is extremely important for us because it has a huge influence on the creation of the development, sorry, not the creation, the development of Arab nationalism in Egypt itself. As we know, Nasser has a long relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood. A difficult one in the end, which ends, of course, with the execution of Said Qutb. But certainly for a period, it appears that Nasser was enamored with some of the ideas of the Brotherhood, and certainly used the Muslim Brotherhood as an organization in support of the revolution, both during and after 1952. So we have to see that this is a very important strand which begins to develop within Arab nationalism. And indeed, the Muslim Brotherhood creates the template for the kind of Islamist politics that we see today, not just in the Sunni world, but also, of course, in the Shia world, with the Islamic Republic in Iran in particular, and of course the development of Shia movements in Lebanon, not just Hezbollah, but also Amal. So I think that's quite important to bear in mind. And what's interesting about the Muslim Brotherhood is, of course, its first foreign outing is in support of the Arab revolt in the mid-1930s, which is a specific revolt in the Palestine Mandate against the Jewish community and against any Jewish immigration. And it's quite interesting that the revolt is, after 3 years, put down by the British and also with some serious assistance from Jewish military involvement. But though it's put down and it is defeated, the aim of it is actually achieved with the passing and adoption by the British of the 1939 White Paper. So that, of course, tells a very important story to the rising nationalist movement in Egypt just before the Second World War, a movement where Britain's role in Egypt since 1882, of course, is very much resented, where the king is regarded, the court is regarded as corrupt and in the hands of the British, which was actually the case. And the national movement, the secular national movement, led by the Waft, was quite marginalized as a consequence of the way in which the British quite cleverly operated. But that meant that Nazi ideas, both within the Muslim Brotherhood and within movements that were more secular, such as New Egypt, in which, of course, Anwar Sadat, future president of Egypt, was a member, certainly meant that by the time of the critical stages of the Second World War in the early 1940s, many of the Egyptian elite were waiting for a Nazi victory to remove the British from Egypt, and as a consequence, would also, of course, been welcomed in the Palestine Mandate by the Mufti, who, of course, by that time was ensconced in Berlin, doing his broadcasting work and raising the Waffen SS in the Balkans. And he undoubtedly would have, they saw the victory of the Nazis and the defeat of the Allies as not only a victory for Arab nationalism, but also a victory in the suppression of the idea of a Jewish state. Of course, after El Alamein, the elites in the Arab world changed their position. But when it came, of course, to the debates of the United Nations on the partition plan for Palestine, then you begin to see how these two routes, the European Enlightenment route and the Islamic routes of Arab nationalism, now take on precisely the kind of tinge of European anti-Semitism, which hadn't really been so, as we said, so prominent within the Arab and Islamic world. And one sees it in the speeches. The Iraqi al-Jamali, for instance, a leading politician in Iraq, pro-Western, by the way, not someone who was involved in any of the Nazi intrigues in Iraq in the 1940s, but someone who is terribly keen to make quite clear that one of the great dangers of the situation about this debate was that the Jews had influence in the United States. The Jews were therefore using this influence in the United States to try to get this partition resolution adopted, which of course provided for a Jewish state alongside an Arab state in an economic union with an internationalization of Jerusalem. And nonetheless, this was a plot, there was a conspiracy within the United States, and that the Jews wielded enormous power. The Syrian delegates, Amir Aslan, for instance, talked about the great dangers of having Palestine swarming with Jews, language which I think would not have been within the traditional Islamic and Arab conception of dealing with Jews. And also, of course, we have the idea that there is a complete conspiracy that the Jewish state would be a threat to international peace and security, not just to the Middle East, but to everywhere else. And it's very interesting as you look at, for instance, the other delegate, Harif, who talks very strongly about the way in which the Arab people have to deal with the fact that even in antiquity, the Israelites disrupted the Middle East, and that's precisely what they're going to do again. So this idea of the disruption of a conspiracy, of evil intention, is something which now becomes very prominent, and of course develops particularly within the two main nationalist movements which develop after the Second World War within the Arab world, Nasserism and Baathism, in which the Jewish presence within the Middle East as a people, not as an individuals or religious community, is regarded as an intrusion. And it's very interesting that if you read some of these accounts about of Arab nationalism, there's an awful lot of rosy history about how Jews, of course, had always been in the Middle East. We got on with the Jews. They were fine as a religious minority, but they're not fine as a national community. And it's quite interesting how that dovetails, of course, with the way in which the European Enlightenment and many modern theories of nationalism, in fact, also deal with the Jews as not really being a people, but inverted commas, just a religion, which I'm sure is something that all of us have heard. And as I began with October the 7th, I suppose it's reasonable to also talk about the other part of Arab nationalism within Palestinian politics, not Hamas, but the PLO. And the PLO, of course, was formed quite late in the 1960s, 1964, before the 1967 war. It was very much a project of the Egyptians, and it was very much sponsored by the then Soviet Union. And of course, the Soviet Union had gone from being the big diplomatic and indeed military backer of a Jewish state in 1947 and 48 to becoming militantly not only anti-Zionist, but increasingly developing an anti-Semitic form of anti-Zionism. And this becomes woven in to the Palestine Liberation Organization and the way in which it sees its role. So its original covenant is very clear that Jews who have arrived in what they would call Palestine, i.e. Israel, since 1948 cannot stay. Only those who were there before 1948 can stay. And there has to be a, inverted commas, democratic secular state. There can be no Jewish polity. And this is very much what the politics which Yasser Arafat pursues, and of course, his successors have pursued in their way. Mahmoud Abbas, the present president of the PLO and president of the Palestinian Authority, is, of course, well known for, in the middle of the 1990s, after the beginning of the Oslo process, was singled out particularly by many Israeli leftists as being the great hope for a solution in Palestine between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And he is a strange person to have selected for this role as peacemaker, because, of course, he is very much a product of the PLO Soviet ideology on Zionism and Israel. And he, of course, wrote his PhD thesis, as I'm sure many of you know, on the alleged collaboration between Zionism and the Nazis in producing the Holocaust. It's called The Other Side, a book is in fact been released in the 21st century. And in this book, you see something which is very significant about the kind of a Soviet anti-Semitism. Because the Soviet anti-Semitism, of course, has to deal with the fact that the Soviet Union's conception of itself is the victor in what it called the Great Patriotic War against the Nazis. And so this thesis, which is produced in a Soviet university, the then Patrice Lumumba Friendship University in Moscow, created precisely to train cadres within the new emerging Third World and the national liberation movements. This thesis, of course, not only argues that the Nazis and the Zionists were close collaborators, but also argues that, of course, Nazism was a terrible and appalling crime, and that the Holocaust was a great crime against humanity and the Jewish people. And what you actually see within this thesis, of course, it has all sorts of relativism, Holocaust denial. He suggests that perhaps only, inverted commas, only 1 million people died. He then uses huge variations of different people to suggest that no one really knows. He throws questions on the existence of the gas chambers. And it is a very well worked out revisionist, historical revisionist, Holocaust denial, effectively, thesis. And of course, it creates this nonsense of Zionist collaboration with the Holocaust. He argues that Zionists wanted to kill Jews in order that those who remained, here's the contradiction, would want a Jewish state. I mean, it's a very sick and horrifying argument, but what's so perhaps more terrifying is that this is an argument which is put forward in a PhD thesis, that the book is published, it's in circulation, not just in the Arab world, but anywhere else. You can buy it and read it. And it represents something which is rather disturbing. And although he has said, particularly during this period when he was being lionized as the great hope of the peace movement from the Palestinian side, he did say, oh, well, I did write that when we were at war with Israel, but now we're not at war with Israel. But he has never changed his position and has never said what he wrote was wrong. So we now have, within the Palestine national movement, a leader who has those views and which has, by the way, some of those anti-Semitic views, as we know, have been on display much more recently. In 2023, at the Revolutionary Council of the PLO, for instance, he made a whole series of terrible statements, anti-Semitic statements. And of course, he is today, I gather, in London, and he has very much the position that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. And that's interesting because if you go back to Rashid Rida in the 19th century, what he said was that the Jews, if they were to create a state, he didn't use the word genocide because it didn't exist, but he said the Jews would eradicate the Arabs from Palestine. That would be their function. And it is quite depressing, I think, to think that those views still have a currency. And as I would say about other things, unfortunately, not just within the Palestinian circles, but also within some Western circles, particularly within, unfortunately, universities and scholarship, particularly around the questions of post-colonialism, critical race theory, and so on and so forth. So in concluding, I don't want to say for 1 minute that the only form of Arab nationalism is necessarily or automatically anti-Semitic. What I want to point out is that there are very long and deep roots of anti-Semitism which exist within the Arab national movement. They come from a long history of the relationship between Jews and Muslims in the Arab and Islamic world. They come from the impact of the European Enlightenment, ideas of nationalism. And to some extent, of course, they have been also influenced by the Nazi ideas and also by, in a more modern and probably more serious sense, by the impact of Soviet anti-Semitism upon national liberation movements. And it's certainly that, I have to say, that we see very clearly in the case that is brought by South Africa at the International Court of Justice against Israel, alleging genocide. Of course, this is not something which was brought recently. It was something that was brought within weeks of the Israel's reply to the October the 7th massacres. That's when it was brought. And to some extent, that shows how the ideas that Zionism or a Jewish state inevitably leads to the eradication of the population, the Arab population, is something which is deeply ingrained, which comes from the association between the African National Congress, which is the main part of the government, and its alliance and with the Palestine Liberation Organization, and also comes as a consequence, I think, of the sense that the surprise, in a sense, in the anti-Semitic circles, that a Jewish state, which was said to be only temporary. And remember that when Abdurrahman Azam, the Secretary General of the Arab League, said before the outbreak, before the declaration of independence of Israel in 14th of May 1948, said, of course, that there will be a war, and it will be like the Mongols, and it will be a war of extermination. And the feeling very much within the Arab world was that the Jews were not capable, as Rashid Rida suggested, of creating a state. They weren't very good at anything other than money, and therefore they wouldn't be able to survive. But interestingly, of course, the Jewish state not only survived in 1947 and in 48, but also, of course, has survived subsequently. And that, I think, is a great shock to Arab nationalism. And one of the big problems which hangs over a solution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is precisely this, that the only possible solution that I can see is some form of recognition of the right of self-determination of Jews and Palestinians, and that means that each side has to recognize that. And of course, that's one thing, certainly, which the current leadership of the Palestinian people, not all the Palestinian people by any means, but the current leadership refuses to do. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much indeed, John. That was a absolutely fascinating kind of distillation of all the different strands of Arab nationalism. Please do write your comments and questions. I know some people have already done so, but I'd just like to kick off with one question, and that is, can you explain the role of the Christians in Arab nationalism?
A very good point. Of course, I did mention El-Khoury, the Syrian, who was a Christian. And of course, Christians have played a very important role in the creation of not only Arab nationalism, but also the communist parties within the Arab world. Now, the Christians have an ambivalent role within the Islamic world. I used to know the Jordanian foreign minister during the time of the Oslo Accords, Kamal Abdul-Jabbar, who was a Christian. But he said something very significant. He said, all Christians in the Arab world are culturally Muslim because our culture is Muslim. And I think that was something that was quite enlightening for me, that the Christians, we of course are attached to very many different denominations. Protestants, I think Edward Said was a Protestant, Greek Catholics, Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Maronites, Assyrian Christians, all of whom have very different confessions and relate to different churches and to different organizations. And what one finds amongst the Christian world is that there is of course, a very big division on the question of anti-Semitism. And this undoubtedly has an effect upon the way in which Christians understand their attachment to Arab nationalism. The Roman Catholic Church, of course, made a very big change on the question of anti-Semitism and has made some serious efforts in addressing the question of anti-Semitism. That's not true of the Orthodox Church. And the Orthodox Church is extremely strong within the Middle East. And if you go to just outside Nablus, you can find a Christian church which has a shrine to a martyr which is said to have been murdered by a Jewish Zionist settler. Actually, it was a priest, he was killed, a monk, he was killed, but he was killed by someone who was a Jew and someone who was an Israeli, but they were actually a mass murderer. They killed many people. They killed Jews, they killed Arabs, but what is worrying is that the shrine to this monk, as a victim of modern Jewish murder, is something which is now a site of pilgrimage and which in his native Cyprus is also something which is held. So I think that there is a sort of a contradictory position on the question of the role of Christians, the minority within the Arab world and within Arab nationalism. Often Christians have had to prove that they are more loyal to the nationalist cause than others because of their minority status.
Right. And I know there are a couple of questions about the relationship of Quranic anti-Semitism and Arab nationalism, which I think you touched on. But can you actually elaborate on this, on why you don't think it's perhaps the most important sort of influence in Arab nationalism?
There are two stories in the Quran
Right.
about Jews. There is the story of the Jews as the people of the book who have to be respected. It's a story of the Jews who produced the Torah with the account of the prophets, of course, Ibrahim, Moses, Musa, and so on and so forth. So like Christianity, Islam has an ambiguous relationship with Judaism because it's relied upon Judaism as being part of the sources of the revelation. And if you look at the Quran, in some way, it's a balance sheet of how well the Jews did with their revelation, how well the Christian did, and why now a new revelation has to be to deal with the errors that were made by both. Then there is the story that the Jews are a danger. Now, the Quran has to be seen, is written over 22 years. It's not written, of course. It's recited. That's what it means. It's a recital. It wasn't written down until 20 years after the death of the Prophet. So when we talk about the Quran, we have to be very careful about its identity. But if you look at the structure of the Quran, there are two sections. There is the section when the Prophet is in opposition, hiding sometimes in what becomes Medina. And there, if you read the verses, they all begin with an address to humanity as a whole. Well, I think it's mankind probably, but I will use a slightly less gendered term. And they're more universal. And in those verses, the Jews are treated with a degree of respect. The second series of revelations are when the Prophet is in power and has returned to Mecca. And those surahs are all addressed to believers. In other words, a much more narrow address. And in those verses, during which, of course, the Prophet is in competition sometimes with the Jewish community, and in that context, he sees the Jewish communities sometimes as being devious. And of course, in those verses, you find a basis, you could say, for discrimination against Jews. But the key question is how, in the exegesis of the Quran, has developed over time. And what one sees, particularly from the 19th century and the emergence of people like Rashid Rida, what you actually see is an increasingly narrow focus upon the particularly anti-Semitic elements. And that, of course, is also connected to the rise of Jewish nationalism. And so what actually is taking place is this politicization of Islam in the 19th century and its concretization in the 20th century. And what we have seen since September the 11th, 2001, in the emergence of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, you begin to realize how what takes place within Islamic history, like within Jewish history or any other cultural history, is that there are big changes which take place as a consequence of the politics. And I think that what we've actually got at the present time is precisely, and it's perfectly reasonable to say, that there are within the Quran sections which can be used in a vile way against Jews. But these particular parts have now become much more dominant as a consequence of this history of the politicization of Islam.
Right. Very interesting. I think Ephraim Nissan made the point that under the Ottoman system, of course, the millet system divided communities up, according to their well, a community, if you like. So perhaps this was a an influence on Arab nationalism.
Yes, of course. I mean, I think that the development of Arab nationalism is against, of course, it develops in the context of the falling, the weakening of the Ottoman Empire. And what the Ottoman Empire is trying to do from the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century onwards, is modernize itself. And it simply can't do it quick enough. So it modernizes the laws, it tries to codify the laws, for instance. But what's interesting, of course, about the Ottoman Empire is that by the beginning of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire has changed out of all recognition that the millet system and so on and so forth is no longer operating. What you've actually got is these westernized laws. But bear in mind something else. The
Sugar.
the Ottoman Empire has a population of 15 million Muslims. The British Empire at the beginning of the 20th century has a population of 100 million Muslims. And that represents, of course, quite an interesting fact when you're thinking about where the Muslim community lived in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And the fact of the matter is that the system of communities, which sounds quite nice and so on and so forth, and had some undoubted advantages, and at certain periods of history were very advantageous for the minorities, were also could become cages. And undoubtedly, that was the big problem that Arab nationalism faced. The first Arab National Congress was held in Paris in 1913. And it had to face what was Arab nationalism, because the Arab world was, of course, filled with minorities, not just Jews, but also Berbers, Armenians, Italians, Greeks, Kurds, a whole series of important ethnic and religious minorities, all of whom had to be attracted to this idea of a national identity. And what's so interesting is that the Arab nationalists failed to involve all those minorities. And Egypt is a good case study of that, because Egypt, at the beginning of the 20th century, was an incredibly multicultural, multi-religious society in which, Alexandria was an incredible place in terms of the relationship between the communities. There were, I think in the before something like 14 or 16 different communities. And if you go to the synagogue in Al Nabi Street in Alexandria, it's a huge institution. It held 1,000 people. It held 1,000 people on the high holidays. And now, how many Jews exist? No, hardly any. How many Greeks? Virtually none. How many Armenians? Very few. Some, but very, very few. Egypt has ceased to be the kind of multicultural society which it was, and that is also increasingly taking place across the Middle East, with the flight of Christians from Syria, from Iraq, the flight of other minorities from the same places and from Egypt and from North Africa. And so actually, Arab nationalism became increasingly based upon the idea of an Arab identity, which excluded precisely those people which the Ottoman Empire claimed it included.
Right. I think Emil made a related point about the census not asking you about your identity and not your religion, and not what a sort of ethnic group you belong to. So I suppose that too might have influenced the way the Arabs sort of thought of the Jews. Not
Yes, I think religious identity, which is something which we find difficult in those of us who are based in Britain to deal with, because we've become an incredibly secular society in which most people don't seem to have any religion. And it's difficult to remember this, to remember that in the 19th century and actually in the Middle East today, religion is an extremely important sign of identity, and that it remains something very important. So I think that that's a very good point. But it's what is so tragic in a way is the way that the minority religions have increasingly left the Middle East. Not just the Jews, obviously, but it's also, I think, particularly Christians also.
And can I ask you about the influence of anti-colonialism? Because surely that was, a motivating force behind the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, the Mufti. I mean, can one explain Arab nationalism as a pragmatic response to colonialism?
Yes, I mean, Arab nationalism begins as with a dilemma in the 19th century. Does it want freedom from the Ottoman Empire, or does it want autonomy within the Ottoman Empire? And then, of course, there's an associated problem because, of course, in Egypt, Egypt is run by the British. And therefore, the Arab nationalist movement in Egypt develops very much in terms of an anti-colonial movement against British colonialism. And that process is very interesting because in the 1920s, with the Arab nationalist movement, the Egyptian nationalist movement becomes quite strong. It's also, of course, the moment at which the Ottoman Empire has been defeated. And in that defeat, of course, eventually the Sultan's title of Caliph is also abolished. And what's interesting that in India, at the same time, Indian Muslims organize a huge movement, the first actually modern mass movement against British rule in India, in defense of the Caliph. It's called the Khilafat movement. And it was supported by the Indian National Congress, but it was spearheaded by Muslims. And their position was that none of the Arab countries should become independent. They opposed the Arab revolt led by the Hashemites, for example, during the First World War. They opposed the idea of Egyptian independence. Strangely, people fighting to get rid of the British in India, but actually wanted the Ottoman Empire to remain. And that's something which Arab nationalism is wrestling with in the 19th century. And of course, after the end of the Ottoman Empire, within Egypt and certainly within North Africa and within the Mandate countries, all those nationalist movements take on now an anti-colonial aspect, and of course want to get rid of the French in Syria, the British in Iraq, and of course in Palestine. The one place where there's not such a movement, of course, is Jordan, but which was, of course, created by an inspired move by Winston Churchill, who, in order to head off support for the Syrian revolt, suggested that the Hashemites might like to form at least an emirate for 6 months in Amman, and it's survived well since.
That's fascinating. Didn't know that. So there was one particular question, actually. I find it very interesting that you actually was a visiting professor at Birzeit University in Palestine. And I know this is a bit of a personal question, but can you tell us a little bit about what it was like and what your views were at the time and whether they've changed and
It was in
whether,
the wake of the
yeah,
Oslo Accords.
yeah.
I mean, I was a visiting professor from 1995 to 2005. I wasn't there all the time. There were some days I had a flat in Ramallah, and
Mhm.
we were starting a law program and a postgraduate law program. And the idea was to create the cadre for the legal cadre for a Palestinian state. And as someone who has always supported a two-state solution, I thought this was a useful thing to do. And I worked with some very amazing people. And one of the things that was done was the creation of the first legal database in Arabic, for example, and Al-Muqtafi. And we had some amazing students. But of course, the Oslo process failed. I insisted on going to teach during the Second Intifada. I was the only foreign person who went to Birzeit to teach during that time. I wanted to see what it was like. We didn't teach in university. We taught in people's houses and schools and so on and so forth because the university was closed. But my views were then that it was possible to create a Palestinian state alongside Israel, and that it was possible that there were within Palestinian society people who you could do business with. And I still think that. I think it's become more difficult. And in the end, by the way, the reason that my position was terminated, not by me, but by them, was because I went to a conference in Israel. Ironically, a conference was 40 years of the occupation. And they said that they were very much against me going to a conference in Israel. I went to Israel a lot during this time. In fact, I was running a project for our university in Haifa. So I was in Israel a great deal as well as in Palestine. And that's why I became then I was involved in opposing the academic boycott of Israel, which I think undermines the idea of a peaceful solution and a two-state solution.
Right, that's fascinating. Okay, well, I know people have written quite a few comments, not so many questions. So I think we'll leave it there. And it just remains for me to thank you very, very much for an absolutely wonderful, wonderful talk. We will do as is our custom. We will put on our commercial break. We will have our commercial break, and everybody will be able to contribute to this event
only those people who've given their names. I think we have 2 or 3 people who haven't given us their names, and they will be taken out of the meeting, unfortunately.
Yeah, but otherwise, everyone else will be able to say what they would like off the record. So just to let you know what's in store for the future, I don't know if Lawrence managed to get
I've got to
the advertisements up. It's a little bit difficult because we're working with one computer
and we're in Israel, and we very fortunately did not have
a siren
during the meeting. Yeah, and Lynn's working on my computer and corrupting
we
it.
told the Houthis, please don't fire a missile during a Harif event, and they actually obeyed. What can you do?
Right. Okay, you do the adverts. I will take out the meeting anyone who I couldn't identify now.
Right. Lawrence, the adverts haven't appeared.
They have appeared.
No.
They're there. What's that?
So our next event is actually, so this is tonight, and should go on. Yes, so we have a very interesting event with Rabbi Isaac Shua, who has Lebanese roots, and then we go on to Jews of Mosul. And our big event is an in-person and an online commemoration of the exodus of Jews from Arab countries and Iran. A lot happening on that front at the moment. There is a session in the UN, even as we speak, in Geneva, presenting the case for Jews from Arab countries and the billions of dollars they lost. So it's all very topical at the moment. So if anybody wants to say thank you or make any kind of last point. I think Lawrence is unmuting everybody.
I've got to stop that. Back in the meeting. I want to stop recording.